This is the lesson overview for Year 1, Lesson 3.2, Responsibility. So just starting with some of the front matter here, the unit learning goal for Unit 3 of this first year is that students will learn about dilemmas and how to navigate difficult situations. For this particular lesson, it's that students will be able to delineate their responsibilities and use the Rings of Responsibility framework to do that. So while this lesson doesn't specifically ask students to go through a dilemma, the Rings of Responsibility are a way to visualize how responsibilities might compete or intersect in a way that might lead to dilemma situations. So you want to be able to make sure to make that point to your students about why you're looking at the Rings of Responsibility and how the Rings of Responsibility relate to different dilemmas. You'll see the assessment recommendations here for how you'll be able to know whether students are developing a deeper sense of their responsibilities and being able to use the Rings of Responsibility framework based on some of the artifacts that they'll be developing and some of the discussion that they'll be having. This lesson most relates to the CASEL Social Emotional Learning Framework around responsible decision making, of course, and the portfolio documentation and resources that you'll need are all here. This lesson notably does not have a prerequisite, so you might be following in sequence, but if not, this lesson doesn't have a prerequisite that you need to have completed before doing it. That said, there is an optional refresher where you can go over the last lesson in the order and talk about what a dilemma is, and then again, sort of make that point that dilemmas might be the result of competing responsibilities. So you'll want to start this lesson though by talking about the rings of responsibility by modeling it. You can see here the rings, so it puts the self at the center, people around you in the second ring, maybe even your community or different groups in the third ring, your profession, or this could be for students like the school in this fourth ring, and then the wider world in the fifth ring. So moving from the self outward and then thinking about how the different responsibilities in each ring might be mapped onto that framework. You could talk through your own example. You could use a fictional character, maybe someone you've talked about in class, to help model how the model functions. This Rings of Responsibility model would function for another person before giving students in the second part of the lesson the opportunity to do it themselves. So there's a handout here with the Rings of Responsibility on it. Students get a decent amount of time, 15 minutes or so, which you can stretch or shrink depending on your students, to fill that out and to actually map their own responsibilities. And then if there's extra time, you can have students pair and share. If not, you can just move on to discussing the Rings of Responsibility as a class. So you can show them the Rings of Responsibility video we have linked here. Again, if there's not time for that and you're looking for a way to trim, you could just skip over and go right to the discussion questions about which rings had the most items and why, how they think their parents, friends, teachers, siblings might have mapped their responsibilities. Maybe you could have students compare and contrast their own rings, and a couple other things here. So hopefully try to have a lively discussion and then follow the conversation where it might go with your students, depending on what's most of interest to them. You could also ask again to try to make that connection to dilemmas, maybe an example of a dilemma that's arisen for a student based on what they see in their Rings of Responsibility diagram. So maybe something that often comes up is like a responsibility to a friend versus a responsibility to oneself, or a responsibility to yourself as a student versus a responsibility to being a community member, maybe with a competing um, issue that you would be dealing with. So try to get students to be thinking about those tensions as they look at their Rings of Responsibility framework. And then to close, students can think of someone related to the class content, and again, kind of write down that person's Rings of Responsibility. So just giving them another chance to practice and use the Rings framework. There are different ways you might even want to do that. So again, thinking about adaptations here, you might want to have students do that in a visual way, or in a diorama, or in a play or a skit. Those are all acceptable ways of demonstrating what understanding might look like in these cases. So you might want to bring in some of those alternative modes of expression, especially depending on your students, what they enjoy, and what their needs are. And then we have a possible enrichment here for you as well. There's another reflection handout about responsibilities if you so choose.